So as I was saying, when speaking with Anne Mills in the spring about the Wild Flora Society talks coming up, and she mentioned a book for September, and I thought to myself, what can I do? I've got a bunch of research projects on the go, but no real updates that are ready to present yet. But maybe I have something from a previous year. And then I thought, well, I used to do a lot of traveling, and I used to take a lot of photos of plants when I was traveling on various trips. So maybe I could do something there. And I thought, I started using iNaturalist just before I went to Iceland. And I took a lot of pictures when I was in Iceland of plants to bump up my iNaturalist species count. So maybe I could look at that. And I looked back at my photos, and I had almost over 50 species of plants featured in photos from this hike that I did through Iceland with my wife back in 2017. So I got creative with the presentation, and just for a little bit of fun, the second slide is going to give it a bit of a background story, so you'll have to read it. I'm not going to speak it, but that should be good for people who have trouble with hearing the presentation online. So here we go. So in summary, it was a bit of a difficult thing to get to Iceland. We had passport problems. It turns out my wife was 3 months pregnant at the time, and they almost didn't let her in because of that. They don't like pregnant ladies to travel to their countries when they might give birth. But anyways, she wasn't due any time near then, so it was okay. But we ended up arriving at different times, and finally I got there. This was the airport in Reykjavik. And I was reunited with my wife and our friends, Vale and Gudjon, who we had met in grad school at UNB. Turns out, I'm just going to grab my cue card so I don't forget what I need to say. So it turns out that Iceland is actually pretty similar to Canada in some ways. So one of the first things they took us to was a place in downtown Reykjavik where there's a lot of food trucks serving gourmet hot dogs and overpriced beer. So we enjoyed overpriced beer and hot dogs. The airport is like most other airports. And yeah, there's some things that are different though, like the need for signage like this in the bathroom. Please do not stand on the toilet, is what the sign says. Like Halifax, they have a lot of people eat a lot of fish. There's a lot of fisheries in Iceland, and the diet historically was heavily biased towards fish products. But if anybody ever offers you fermented shark, say no. If you can imagine cold smoked tuna that's been marinated in Windex. That's what fermented shark tastes like. Say no. But it's a historical food. It's a way that they would preserve shark. They would bury it in the peat and ferment it over the winter. And that was a way of preserving food, because where else are you going to get food in the middle of winter in Iceland, I guess. They're really into trolls and Vikings in Iceland. Vikings is understandable. There's a lot of Norse culture, Norse roots in Iceland. The trolls is part of their mythology too, I guess. So those things are a little bit different. One of the things that you notice when you're coming from the airport, it's these vast green and black fields. And this one in particular, there's a thermal power plant at the end of this field. They get most of their energy in Iceland from thermal power because it's a sort of volcanic area. It's cheap and easy to get at. But this is all lava stone. All this black rock is lava stone, and it's covered in a little moss called Racemichium lanuginosum. And we have the same moss in Nova Scotia. It grows on top of rocks out in coastal barrens in some cases, and in the alpine zone in the Cape Breton Highlands. It's a little green moss, and the leaves have sort of frosted tips. So vast areas of Iceland are covered in this moss. But we weren't there to hang out in Reykjavik the whole time. We had our sights set on this Laugavegur Trail, which starts in Landmannalaugar and goes through 55 kilometers to Thorsmork. If you're a very intrepid person, you can do an extra 24 kilometers to Skogar. We didn't do that part, the little dotted line at the bottom. Kind of covered up by the, what's this little setup professional audio? So just to give you a sense of the scale, you can see the inset map in the top left of Iceland. Reykjavik is in that peninsula just to the left of the magnified box. So it's about a 90-minute drive from Reykjavik to the trailhead at Landmannalaugar. Here's an elevation map showing the change in elevation over the course of the trail. You can see there's some short stretches that are pretty steep, some longer stretches that are not as steep, and some that are a little bit of both. But quite a bit of elevation change. And I'll give you updates on the map as I kind of go through the presentation. This is a screen grab of my iNaturalist observations from the Fjallabak Reserve at Landmannalaugar to all the way down to Thorsmork. The main features of this stretch of trail are pyroclastic mazes, I call them, thermal vents and springs, talus slopes of pumice, and lava fields, and then shattered obsidian plateaus. And you're like, what the heck is that? I'll show you. So it's this first stretch with a really steep ascent from Landmannalaugar to Raftinos. So this is our bright, shiny, happy faces at the start of the trail. Very white skin, haven't gotten much sun yet. You can see there's lots of buses and cars down there. A lot of people just go there for a day hike. And it's beautiful scenery. The shot on the left shows you this maze, this lava rock maze that we're hiking through. It reminded me kind of the, it's what I call the pyroclastic maze. So pyroclastic rock is from violent volcanic eruptions. And it reminded me of, for anyone who's a Tolkien fan, the jagged rock mazes of Emin Muir as they're approaching Mount Doom in Tolkien's Middle Earth. It reminded me a little bit of that. I was just waiting for Smeagol to jump down at me from up top. But it's really cool. Like the sides, there's a little bit of weedy stuff just from presumably coming in on people's boots, you know, some bluegrass, things like that get just a little bit into there, but they don't go too far because the environment is too harsh. So a lot of Raccometrian moss on the sides, a nice little area of cotton grass on the other side of one of those little boulder chunks. So this was a cotton grass called Areoforum, where do I have it here? Areoforum schweitzeri. Yeah, schweitzeri or Schweitzer's cotton grass. This is what it looks like in a broad perspective. You can see all those jagged rocks there. And amidst some sheltered spots in these little rocky areas, we were able to find some flowering plants, the first showy flowering plants of the hike. So these ones here on the left, we have Silene acaulis, moss campion, velvet bells in the middle, Bartzia alpina. And on the right, nestled in a little nest of Racometrium is least willow or Salix cerevacea.
Yes.
At a few points on the hike, it seemed like the rocks were waving to us. The photo on the top left, you can kind of see a little hand right in the middle, poking out of the ground, presumably a giant waving as we walked by. So I was waving back. And you can really get a sense of the impact, you know, for those of you who don't pay much attention to moss. Look at Iceland. The whole country is covered in moss. People say it's rugged, it's not good for growing trees, not good for growing vegetation. It's covered in moss. I argue differently. It's great for growing moss. And I mentioned Racometrium melanoganosum already, but another really common one we saw was Polia wallenbergii, which is usually associated with these sort of thermal seeps where hot water would bubble up from underground, or where a thermal vent, a steamy vent, would melt a little patch of snow or glacier and cause a little thermal spring. It really liked those springs. Whenever we saw that bright green, vibrant green color, we knew that there was water there from a melting glacier or a thermal spring. Some of those vents got really unfriendly to plants. You can see the next section of the trail is really kind of desolate. So the thermal vents in this area were so common that you never left the smell of sulfur in the air. It was omnipresent. And the minerals bubbling up in these thermal vents would discolor the rocks all around them and leave these mineral deposits, these sort of whitish mineral deposits, in some cases with sort of a rusty tinge to them as well. So pretty desolate stretch of trail there for the most part. After about 90 minutes, I'll show you a few more slides as I mention these vents and thermal springs. There's a lot of Racometrium off in the distance, but the trail itself tended to be close to where these vents were because that's what people wanted to see, I guess. So it took us a little while, but we eventually got to some areas after about 90 minutes of hiking, to some areas that had year-round snow cover. There's a nice little thermal vent you can see there bubbling up with some water and discoloring the ground around it all red. You can see that Polia moss really sticking out along the freshwater seeps there. And then we got up to these high elevation areas where there were no more vents, but this was the Shattered Obsidian Plateau. Huge chunks of obsidian all over the landscape, and no plants left anywhere. Not even the mosses were up here really. Occasionally you might find one just in a little crack on its own, but none of those blankets that were covering the hills anymore. This was at about 1,000 meters elevation. So the first night we stayed in this Hrathdanuskr camp. And it's the highest camp of the hike at 1,050 meters elevation. It looks like nothing but snow and rocks. I went for a little walk after we set up camp, and I found I'm just going to back up to that slide in a minute, a little thermal hot spring. And so I went for a hunt, and I found little plants nestled in the Polia moss. Those plants were on the left, hairy kidneywort, or Micranthus stellaris, and starwort mousy on the right, Dichodons cerastoides, formerly cerastian cerastoides. Pretty little things. And you can see, relative to my fingers, they're pretty small. Things that are big don't seem to do well at 1,000 meters elevation right next to a glacier, go figure. But they were so small, they were kind of nestled within that boundary layer, protected by the moss and the seepy water. I'm just going to back up a couple of slides to show the profile of the next section of the hike. So the second day of the hike, July 25th, we were set to hike 11 kilometers, mostly downhill. We were really looking forward to this. We thought, oh, this will be super easy. Only 100 meters uphill, 600 down. I had already, after the first stretch, taken on an additional 2 pounds for my waist pack. the main features of this next section are year-round snowbanks at first and talus slopes that are pretty sparsely vegetated. A few thermal vents again and springs. After that, we reach some subalpine heathland and our first river crossing. So starting off with some year-round snow and a few little meltwater streams. You get a sense of just how vast this landscape is. Like I wasn't expecting this when I set up to hike in Iceland. It almost looks like more like a desert than it does like a boreal climate or a subarctic climate. With those brownish talus slopes look like sand dunes almost. Anyways, we hiked through this landscape, found some neat things like ice caves, and took a walk in some of them. Not much in the way of plants there. And then we finally reached the subalpine heathland where we began to see more plants again. So took a little break and did some botanizing. And some of the first plants we saw in this more heathland type habitat. On the bottom left, we have alpine bistort, which I don't think is a very nice name for such a pretty plant. Bistort vivipara. One of the interesting things about plants in Iceland is there's a prevalence of certain life strategies, and viviparous growth seems remarkably common compared to plants that we have in Nova Scotia. So for those of you who've never seen a viviparous plant, it basically means the seeds start to germinate while they're still attached to the mother plant. And so viviparous bistort or alpine bistort, habitually the seeds will start to germinate while they're still in the mother plant and presumably fall and have a better chance at establishing themselves as young plants. But we see this across many different plant groups in Iceland. Presumably an adaptation to deal with the short growing season. I haven't looked up literature on it. And right beside it, we see more moss campion, Silene. It seems to be the only species, this moss campion, that can really dig in on these talus slopes where there's a lot of erosion. It has a very deep taproot, so it holds on pretty well in these sorts of habitats. So on the left here, we have a mystery plant. Does anyone want to take a guess at the genus of this plant? Looks super tiny. It's nestled again in Rhacometrium moss. It's a genus we have in Nova Scotia. Christopher, good guess. It's not in the mustard family. It's a gallium. This little gallium, Gallium normanii, slender bed straw, it's actually kind of succulent and very, very, very tiny. And it nestles in among these mossy areas on the sides of the trail. It didn't look at all like a gallium when I first saw it until I got that sort of side view and saw the whorls of leaves, as in most other bed straws we have here. There's a little moonwort fern at the top of the photo on the right, just a bit to the left side. It was too young for me to identify it at that point, but I do have another moonwort in the presentation, so don't worry. And then some Peltidra lichens in the top left corner as well. Another one I saw in this little break spot was common butterwort. So as you can imagine, with a lot of the heathland habitats we have here, we have a lot of carnivorous plants. Another way to deal with sort of harsh environments that are low in nitrogen is to get your nitrogen out of the bugs. And so this common butterwort and other carnivorous plants feature prominently in the heathland landscapes of Iceland. And by prominently, I mean in very short form. They're still pretty small in stature, but noticeable because they're so beautiful. All right, so towards the end of this second day, we were approaching the campsite called Alftavatten, and we were getting into a flatter valley, and we ended up pitching our tent beside this lake. The lake is actually named Alftavatten. And we found some nice plants on the lake shore as the evening fog set in on us. So this was the campsite. So people have made a bunch of little ridges to help protect their tents from being lifted off when the winds get stiff. But these were some of the prettiest plants we saw on the trip, I thought. On the bottom left, we have sea thrift or Armeria maritima. On the bottom right, we have, top right, we have alpine fireweed, Caminerian latifolium, a dwarf version of the common fireweed we have out here. Much showier flowers, though, bigger flowers. And on the bottom right, alpine bistord, again, Bistorta alpina, amidst some Poa and Festuca grasses. Sorry for the grass fans in the crowd. I did not identify the grasses in these photos, but I do have a couple grasses later on for you. So don't fret if grasses are your thing. The next stretch from Altavatten to Botnar Emster, I'm not sure why it has two names. Presumably one is the campground and one is the landform, but I'm not sure which is which. Day 3, 16 kilometers. That was a long hike. Only 100-meter elevation decrease, so the elevation change wasn't bad. About 200 meters uphill, 300 down. Backpack stayed about the same compared to the previous night. Probably that was a mistake. The mossy lava rock fields were kind of wearing out in the first few kilometers. There was 2 river crossings and then what I call the black sand or gravel desert, which is all just lava rock in various forms. So it seems like it's a long sort of straight stretch, and it largely is. This black sand gravel desert is really cool and really foreign. It's not something we'd ever see in Nova Scotia. So again, sort of heathland habitats, some gravelly areas. There's our first river crossing. You just take off your hiking boots and go. It was very cold water, yes. Yeah, it was ice cold water. It felt good on the feet though after a bit of a walk. So first 6K had lots of mossy fields and a few more plants, mostly stuff we had already seen. Right before we got to the Black Desert, we encountered a couple of neat things in a little ravine. The first one on the left is Botrychium lunularia, or common moonwort. And on the right, we have frog orchid, or Dactylorhiza viridis, which I thought was aptly named. Those little flower buds do look kind of froggish, like a frog head or something. Yes, it's an orchid. The second river crossing, we didn't have to take our boots off on, is this cool bridge. With a little canyon running below. And there's a little rest stop after 5K. It was a second possible campground, but we hit the 5K mark and we thought, oh, we're full of energy, no problem. We'll do this next stretch. And then we encountered the Black Desert. So this whole area was just otherworldly. It felt like I would say moonscape, but I don't think the moon has rocks like this. All lava origin. The gravel I'm holding in my hand at the bottom right is exactly like the lava rocks you put in your barbecue. Very porous. On the bottom left, that big black shiny rock at the top of the screen, that's more of a dense sort of probably like hardened lava flow type thing. And at various times on this stretch of the hike, it was either very fine sand or coarse gravel. It seemed to depend on how it was eroding and what it was eroding from, whether it was blowing in or had been largely deposited in place. But it was just this vast black desert. Lasted about 10 kilometers of the hike. The only 2 plants we found in this entire stretch were in the first kilometer of the desert. Racometrium moss was one, and sea campion was the other. This little guy here. So another feature of Icelandic plants in general is they seem to share a lot of features in common with plants that are halophytes or deal well with dune or coastal type environments in Nova Scotia. So sea campion is a good example of that. Silene uniflora for those who want them. You can see in the shot on the top, there's sort of that sandy dust blowing around in the wind. You get these little dust storms wicking up the finer particles of this black sand. And in the canyons, the water itself turns black with the grit and the silt from this black sand desert. It's pretty impressive. But when you look off in the distance, often the mountains themselves seem green. It's kind of opposite of the way you normally expect it. Normally you walk on the green and you see the mountains are kind of dark colored and rocky off in the background. Here it was the opposite because the mountains are what are providing the shelter against erosion, whereas these vast level plains are just constantly getting whipped by the wind. So here we are hiking through more black sand desert. You can see in some cases it actually forms dunes. The photo on the bottom right, you've got this fine black sand with footprints that are already wearing away just after they've been made. Another rock was giving me a thumbs up there. I wonder if I can hide this little top bar. The last few kilometers of this 16-kilometer long day were pretty hard. My feet were hurting a fair bit after that, and my wife Brenda was showing some signs of iron deficiency, needing to stop every 10 to 15 minutes for a little rest, which is a common thing when you're pregnant. So the next campground was a very welcome sight when we finally arrived there. It seemed to just go on and on and on. Finally, we arrived and we hiked down into the campsite and pitched our tent. And I think she's actually, my wife Brenda is inside the tent right now, just laying down. And I think I made supper that night and we didn't do much walking, but then I saw there was a ditch full of plants. So I went over to the ditch full of plants and I took some pictures. In the ditch, I found more velvet bells, Bartzia alpina, or alpina. Also, in the second from left is lesser wintergreen, Pyrola minor. Third from left is northern leafy green orchid, or Plantanthera hyperborea, which I think also occurs in Canada. And on the far right, we have alpine timothy, or Phleum alpinum. There's a grass. But this ditch was dominated, not by those lovely little flowers, but by lime grass, Lamus arenarius, much like we sometimes see in sand dunes in Nova Scotia. Also by Angelica archangelica, which is also known as garden angelica. It's not a species we have here, but very similar to Angelica atropurpurea. And you may have noticed already in some of my photos, the ubiquitous equisedum events. It seems like this equisedum, this little horsetail, is able to invade wherever other plants have established. I never saw it on its own, but whenever there was other plants getting their feet in the ground somewhere, this little equisedum seemed to tag along. So that brings me to the last leg of the journey, or the last leg of the trail. I took a little more weight again this time after that last hike. I needed a little bit more help, and so her pack weight went down and mine went up a little bit, but it was still pretty manageable. The last section was also a long hike, 15 kilometers, about 400 uphill, 640 down, 400 meters uphill, 640 meters down. The main features of this last stretch, there was a little bit more of that black desert, but mostly it was a transition into seeing green stuff again more regularly. So there's a few gorges, ravines, and little hidden areas that had lots of plants growing in them. We saw this sort of black sandy subalpine heathland where we had much more consistent vegetation, especially woody vegetation. So I'll show you some of those photos. And as you can see, it was mostly downhill, but there was a couple of pretty good climbs in there. So still pretty tiring. The first plant we saw in this last stretch was heather, Luna vulgaris. It was lovely to see. It wasn't flowering in this particular spot, but we did see some flowering later on. And in case anybody was wondering, the moss at the bottom left of the photo is Bacometrium.
Yeah.
So here's one of the lovely canyons that we went to in that day. There's a deep river, and you can see where the water has eroded through many different layers of lava rock or lava deposits, exposing some beautiful rock faces. And there's lots of cool vegetation, or at least it looked cool from far away. I couldn't get down there. There was this big switchback. The photo on the top left shows the hill we had to descend via switchback trails to get to the bridge that allowed us to cross this canyon. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity to botanize. If I'd tried to climb that slope, I would have been knocking a lot of rocks and sand down, possibly slip into the canyon below. So we stuck to the trail. But it was sort of the most substantive vegetation we'd seen since the parking lot we got dropped off. So it was nice to take pictures of. The next little section there, it was a little straight stretch and then another nice big hill climb. You can see some basalt columns off in the distance there. And on our way up that next hill climb, I had a little bit of time to kill when I got to the top. And so I found some Arctic willow, Salix arctica, and took a picture of a little stereocolon or foam lichen on the bottom left there, and some familiar species to those who remember their mosses in Nova Scotia, Polytrichum piliferum, or fringed haircap moss. And there's a photo from the hilltop. So I was there on, this would have been July 24th, this day. This would have been the 27th. Yes, the 27th. And from the 24th to the 28th is when we were going to hike. There wasn't 24-hour daylight. They were long days. It's high latitude, but not it's not that much higher than some parts of Canada that have long days in the summer. Like it's not that much higher latitude than Edmonton, for example. It's not 24-hour daylight or anything like. So at this point in the trail, we were starting to see many more plants, again, in those sheltered little spots where there was a bit of shade or a bit of moisture accumulating. So you can see some familiar friends here from Nova Scotia. We have black crowberry at the top on the left side there, Petrum nigrum on the bottom left. Another species we also have in Nova Scotia, although it's a little bit rare, bog bilberry, Vaccinium uliginosum. And on the right side, it's a species that I've never seen in Nova Scotia, and I don't think we have it here, ladies' bedstraw. We have a lot of cool straws in Iceland. Gallium verum. And amidst several of those photos, you see a little bit of Arctic willow and dwarf birch. So as you can see, we're getting more into what looks like heathland here. And to us, the most noticeable change was the appearance of shrubs. So in the photo on the bottom right shows that really dramatically. You can see that actually they've got some height on the shrubs at the bottom right photo. And that's mostly one of the willow species. They have a few willows in Iceland that are real Arctic or subalpine species, real hardy willows. And they're fun to identify because they're all very distinctive. It's not a trial where you need catkins in every case or anything like that. All their leaves are pretty different, and it's pretty easy to pick them out. So in this photo here, you can see woolly willow on the right side, magnified, and common juniper, Juniperus communis on the bottom left. And I've mentioned the similarity with sand dune plants a couple of times. Here you can really see it personified. The trail in the photo on the top left, the sand and the gravel amidst the shrubs on either side of the trail was actually mounding up because of the shrubs that were there. And the only reason it wasn't mounding up on the trail is because the hikers were keeping the plants from growing there just by hiking. And so in areas where people did a lot of walking, the plants wouldn't grow and there was no building up of the sand. But that's how dunes build in many parts of coastal Nova Scotia. And so it's neat to see that same process playing out in these black sandy habitats in volcanic areas. It's basically what marram grass does in dunes in Nova Scotia. And it's really distinctive too when you see you can definitely tell which way the winds typically blow and which way the harshest winds typically blow, which is right off the glaciers at this point in time. Because we were hiking pretty close to a glacier within a couple kilometers of it. And on the leeward side of the wind that would be coming off the glacier, you had these luxurious communities of mosses and lichens developing on the leeward sides of the rocks. But on the windward side, there was nothing. It was just scoured clean. Presumably the sand and probably some ice scour as well. And the photo on the right-hand side of the screen is downy birch, Betula pubescens. And here we have the subalpine heathland. And those reds and pinks that you see, those are a mix of grass flowers and heather flowers and campion flowers. There's all different shades of pink mixed in there. There's some thyme. I'll show you some close-up pictures. But when we saw this view, we both breathed a sigh because it's green again and there's beautiful flowers everywhere, and it smelled like you could smell the vegetation after coming out of all those fairly harsh environments. You can see there are some of the mounded up thyme plants. So here are close-ups of a few things. On the bottom left, we have Myosotis arvensis, or field forget-me-not. On the top left, sorry, I'm just double checking that there. I think it's actually, yeah, the top left, we have wild thyme, or Thymus praecox subspecies arcticus. In the middle photo, we have heather. Actually, I think the flowers are thyme and there's heather mixed in with it there. Questioning the label I had put on it. But the middle top photo is a mix of heather, which is mostly green and not flowering, and thyme, which is flowering in pink there. And bottom center, we have beach pea, another coastal plant we have in Nova Scotia, Lethrus japonicus. Top right, we have bearberry, Arctostaphylos uva ursi, again, a species we also have in Nova Scotia, typically associated with sand barrens here. And on the bottom right, another viviparous plant. This is Festuca vivipara, viviparous sheep fescue. You can see the little grains actually germinating while they're attached in that grass spike. There's another nice photo of some subalpine heathland. The arrival at this small shrub forest, which is not a technical term, it's just something I invented yesterday, just before Thorsmork, was probably the first substantive woody vegetation that we saw. And by substantive, I mean as tall as us or maybe slightly taller. And it was dominated by a species called tea-leaved willow, which typically grows upwards of 2 to 3 meters in that habitat. You can see it here. Even though it can technically grow up to 5 meters, it rarely got more than 3 meters where we were walking. And as we made our final approach to the Thorsmork campground, we also came across this wood cranesbill, or Geranium sylvaticum, and heath-spotted orchid, or Dactyla immaculata, in a little sheltered wet ravine area. There's a close-up on the flowers of the orchid. So around the camp at Thorsmork, right by our tent, actually, I saw some interesting little weedy things. There was this one on the right is hairy lady's mantle. Now, I knew one lady's mantle from seeing it in gardens in New Brunswick at the time, but I didn't realize there was so many species of lady's mantle out there. And Iceland has 7 species of lady's mantle. A couple are invasive. They didn't all start there. This one is Alchemilla filicalis, hairy lady's mantle. There's a close-up of the hairy stems that you use to identify them. And then on the right, we have Fragaria vesca, woodland strawberry, species we also have in Nova Scotia. And in all the photos here, you can also see Equisetum arvense. Seems to be the universal sidekick. Just on the outskirts of the campground, where it was getting up into the trails again, we also saw a few neat plants there. So one on the left, we see heath woodrush, or Luzula multiflora. In the middle, there is another bedstraw. It's Gallia verum again, ladies' bedstraw. It's got those lovely yellow flowers. And on the right, I'm betting most of you can guess the genus of that one. But if you're in Iceland, you don't need to identify the species. There's only one rubus in Iceland. So this is stone bramble, Rubus saxatilis. Who knew rubus taxonomy could be so easy? On the riverbank near our campsite, we found Hill's willow herb, or hill willow herb, Epilobium calinum, shown on the left here. And on the right, a familiar sedge to many people here, Carex nigra, or black sedge. So our campsite in Thorsmork, which basically means Thor's Valley, we had probably 8 hours to kill before our bus was to arrive to pick us up after the next morning. We were used to getting up at 7, 8 o'clock, go for a hike, and we didn't want to sit on the grass for 6 hours waiting for our bus after having breakfast. So after we had a filling and leisurely breakfast, we decided to go for a day hike on this loop here called the Tin Fuel Loop from the Langadeller campground. And thankfully, the backpack weight was down to 2 pounds. It's just a little bag at that point to carry our water bottles. So that it felt very freeing going on a little day hike without a backpack. And we got to see some more stuff on that hike. Got this beautiful view of the Thor's Valley. Plants everywhere. It was nice to see. That glacier just at the top of the mountain is several square kilometers in size, very round shaped too. There was an icy cold wind blowing off it all day long. So you had to bundle up, even though it looked pretty sunny and warm. So the 2 plants featured here from that little loop we hiked were the 8-petaled mountain avens, or Dryas octopetala, on the left. And on the right, alpine meadowroot, or Thalictrum alpinum. And in both photos, Raccometrium moss. Now, getting out of Thorsmork requires a little bit of ingenuity. They like their 4x4s in Iceland. That's how they get around, and a lot of the country is not accessible if you don't have a big 4x4 truck. And all of these are jacked up minibuses or like 10-passenger vans. They're probably about a foot higher off the ground than those are most of the time in Canada. And it's because you have to drive across the river. There's no bridges in this area of Iceland. There's a fun little tractor there with a pirate flag and another jacked up truck. You also notice that many of them have snorkels attached to them, because in some places the river is pretty deep. You still drive across it. There's our bus, our jacked up bus. Again, it's about a foot higher than a normal bus would be. The luggage got a little bit wet on the way back in the luggage compartment. They told us not to put any electronics in the luggage compartment. I thought it was fun. It looked like a little caterpillar with those mirrors the way they are. And there's some pictures from the bus ride back. You can see us crossing the river. It's very tilty because you're just driving over big rocks on these big tires and very rocky. I got some pictures showing it. And there's some beautiful waterfalls in Iceland too, from all the meltwater of the glaciers and things. So this was a photo from the highway, the bottom photo there that you see with the big impressive waterfalls from the highway on the way back to Reykjavik. And I put this one in. This isn't from the hike. This is from a tour of a little hot spring area we did afterwards. But I put it in because I wanted to point out, after showing you all those pictures of like shrubs and like dwarf shrubs and little herbaceous plants, little annual things, lots of moss. I want to show that, yes, there are trees in Iceland as well, actual, honest to goodness trees. I think those are poplars and birches and a few spruce and pine in the background. From what I hear, they're mostly planted, but they can grow in some parts. So there you go. There's some trees in Iceland. And that's all I have to share about Iceland plants. Thanks for your attention. Are there any questions from anybody? Let's get the lights on. Okay, so I think Jeremy Lundholm in our front row here has a question.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
That was great. What an incredible.
It was a trip of a lifetime for sure.
Would you recommend?
I would recommend it if you have a decent pair of hiking boots and are okay with hauling a gear for 4 days. You can do it in 5. There is another camp in there. It's beautiful. Yeah, I definitely recommend it, but there's definitely some hard hiking sections, so you have to be
Begonias or other lichens in those landscapes. There's just so much moss, not so much.
So the question is, with those vast carpets of Raccometrium covering the lava flows, why do you think there are no lichens covering some sections of them? I can speculate about a few things. I haven't given a lot of thought, to be honest. One is that Iceland, at least the lower parts of Iceland, are very, very humid, or maybe humid is the wrong term, but there's a high amount of precipitation, a lot of rainfall. I mean, some lichens do well when there's a high amount of precipitation, but I think in a lot of places in Canada where you have really strong development of moss and lichen as a ground cover, there's sort of a succession that occurs early in the development of that ground there, where lichens dominate for the first 100, 200 years, and then mosses can kind of take over. In some cases, that's mediated through the increase in shade that comes with tree colonization. In other cases, it seems to be an innate property of a very humid habitat. So I would guess it's something to do with the humidity, but I'm not sure. It's a very good question. It's worth looking into for sure. I think Joan Cormier might have a question.
I'm interested in pollinators. Were you inundated with mosquitoes and stinging insects? I didn't see any pictures of bees.
So Joan says she's interested in pollinators, and she asked if we were inundated with mosquitoes and other insects. No is the simple answer. There were not many bugs. There was a few little biting flies in that last day as we approached the Thorsmore campground. But I think mostly it was just too high elevation and too cold for the bugs to come out. I mean, I'm sure we saw the odd, fly or pollinator buzzing around, but there certainly wasn't hordes of mosquitoes or black flies attacking us at any point in that trip.
Thank you.
So a question from Bob, was the trail well marked? And yes, it was very well marked. And in fact, it almost didn't need to be marked because you could see, like, it was just so well worn from the boot tracks, so you could just follow the trail. Yes?
Just the weather, you said it was very wet. No rain and the photos and all. The light seems pretty incredible. I was wondering whether the pictures of the beginning and end of the day.
So the question, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Jim.
Jim asked about the weather and the light. So he asked, it seemed like the weather was good for the trip, and I said it was a rainy place, but he was wondering if I took photos at the beginning and end of the day to assess the light. Not really. We just snapped photos as they come. I'm not any sort of professional photographer at all. I was just using my smartphone for most of those things, or a little field point and shoot camera. And we did have rain, but we didn't take pictures when it was raining. I think it's the best answer there. And there was a lot of fog too, especially down in the valleys where there would be warm air coming up, meeting the glacial air from up above. That seemed to generate fog that would just stick with us for a few hours at a time. So, yeah. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, it looked like the sun shone all 5 days.
It shone, and we took pictures when the sun was shining. Yeah. David Patrician has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, David.
Yeah, I just wonder, is there any indication that of recent exotic species coming into Iceland?
The question is there any evidence of recent exotic species coming into Iceland? I haven't looked into the exotic species in that great of detail, David, so I couldn't say how recent the invasions have been of the species I saw that were, said to be invasive. I was relying on a little book of Iceland plants that I picked up, and where it said they were invasive, I took that at face value. It didn't have timelines associated with them. One could certainly speculate that the increased attention to that particular trail may come with some increased invasions on that particular trail. But at the same time, it's a pretty harsh environment. So there's probably not a lot of invasive species that they would have to worry about from other places in the same way that warmer places would have to.
Yeah, I think historically there was a lot more forest there, and that a lot of that was cut down by settlements maybe 1,000 years ago. So there could have been quite a bit of flora that came in with people from mainland. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, so David suggested that there were, he seems to recall there used to be more forest there about 1,000 years ago, and people cut a lot of them down.
There's a lot of sheep grazing.
Things from different people, and I haven't looked into the evidence. I haven't read any literature about it to kind of settle the dispute. But our hosts told us that there weren't any real tree species there before Iceland was colonized, so to speak. And that the colonizers brought in aspen and the larger birch and the proper trees where it used to be dominated in the dwarf birches and things like that. I don't know how accurate it is. It would be worth looking into, though. I'm sure it's an interesting story.
The other thing I wonder, just if I'm still open there, are all the soils alkaline there? Would you know? I suppose they are, aren't they?
Yeah, the question is, are all the soils alkaline? And I suspect they are. I didn't have a pH meter with me at the time, but typically volcanic soils are pretty neutral to alkaline. Basalt certainly would be, and there was a fair bit of basalt there. I mean, if it gets hot enough, and turning into obsidian and things like that, I think there's very little interaction with the environment around it. It's basically glass, so there would be nothing coming off of that. But yeah, my guess would be that it's neutral to alkaline, generally speaking. But something else to kind of consider with respect to the rock and how it relates to the vegetation is, like lava rock is very porous in the broad sense, not all types obviously, but like the lava rock that we have in our barbecues is very porous, and that seems to work really well with mosses. There were a few places in Reykjavik where we saw walls made of this porous lava rock that were subsequently colonized and just coated in moss. So there's something about that porous rock the moss really loves.
Yeah.
And it could also be its alkalinity that is beneficial. It's almost certainly neutral to alkaline. The question is, do I know of anywhere in North America that has that sort of dominance by Raccometrium mosses? I don't. It's a simple answer, but I would be keen to explore more of the coast of Newfoundland and see what the exposed rocky areas are like up there. I suspect some of the vast limestone areas on the Great Northern Peninsula up there probably have some fairly vast Raccometrium cover areas. And I have been told by botanists that I've met with in recent years that large parts of Arctic Canada are covered in moss over rocky areas, but like Raccometrium moss specifically. But I haven't been there, and I'm not sure what species it would be.
That's interesting because I have done a little traveling in the north, both in Alaska and Canada, and also a little bit in Newfoundland. And Raccometrium lanuginosum is really common. It seems to be the moss. And even here in Nova Scotia, in some of those rather dry, hot, open areas around rocks, you find Raccometrium lanuginosum. So I think when I was in northern, let's see, where was it? I can't think where. Anyway, for the minute. Anyway, the northern part of north of BC, Alberta. That's where I did see quite a bit. The ground was just covered in Raccometrium. Other species as well, but lanuginosum stands out.
In the Maritimes, I've seen Raccometrium on talus slopes a fair bit. And for those who didn't hear, Anne was just kind of confirming my suspicion that parts of northern Canada and Newfoundland have quite a bit of Raccometrium, and also suggested coastal parts of the Maritimes. But I've also seen it growing pretty extensively on talus slopes. So I don't know if there's a feature of just that exposed rock that's hard for other things to grow on, maybe. You know, the lack of competition might be a part of it.
Yeah, Sean, John here. It's there's an awful lot of Raccometrium in Newfoundland, and it's quite often just because of the lack of anything else growing on the higher hills, and a lot of fog and sort of dampness and just general cold, and it's just super. Even in St. John's, Signal Hill is on one side of our harbor, 500 feet high, and there's the whole top of it's covered with it. You know, it's.
You're cutting out a little bit, John, but I think we got the gist of it. Is the Raccometrium covers large parts of Newfoundland, including Citadel Hill and other places around St. John's.
Signal Hill, yeah, in St. John's. That was real common.
Signal Hill, yes. I've been in the field for the last 8 days, and I drove up here after serving for Boreal, felt like in this morning, so my brain is not functioning at full power right now.
Were there very many orchids?
Question is, were there very many orchids? And yes, there were. I mean, I showed pictures of 2 of them up there. I saw those 2 species a few times. We probably missed a few others. You know, we were only there on that trail for 4 days, and as you know, orchids all have their preferred flowering times. So, but I saw lots of orchid-like leaves of things that I couldn't identify because they weren't flowering. So yeah, I think there probably are quite a few orchid species, and I think that's another sort of heathland thing too. Is orchids seem to love heathlands, and it's probably more than I was able to show on the presentation.
Thanks.
I think Platanthera hyperborea occurs in Canada too, but yeah, I think the frog orchid, it's not something I've seen. But certainly it's definitely a mix of species, but I agree it was more biased towards European species than Canadian species.
Frog orchid on Fair Isle, Shetland. It's grows on the north part or the northern coast, or just down from the North Light, and it is owned because of the sheep. It's only a few, maybe 1 or 1.5 centimeters tall, and it's just where the sheep can't get down to it, but it grows there, and it's still there. I heard one this year, and I saw it myself when we were there, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So I bet you it's around there somewhere.
What was that, Ann?
We didn't get the species.
Sorry. Oh, I don't know what, I can't remember but it's the frog orchid.
That was in the Shetlands?
Yes, and on Fair Isle, Shetland.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was quite a bit of sheep grazing around Iceland. Even on some parts of the trail, there were sheep grazing. So maybe that's the influence is bringing some of those plants in on the sheep or in the sheep.
And they're so small. I mean, you really you'd almost have to get down on your hands and knees and crawl around to see it if it is sheep grazed area. And that's certainly what we had to do when we were on Shetland, on Fair Isle.
Thanks for all the questions and discussion, everybody. It was fun.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Sean. That was really, really good.
Well, is this taped, and can we listen later on?
Yes, I've hit record, so I'm hoping it will work the way it has in the past. I think it's all, we're still recording now. I think it's working well. So I will post it if all works well. And just for my knowledge, did it play okay on your end? Because I wasn't able to monitor it. So was everything?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. And thank you for helping us work this through as well, Sean. I appreciate that. And I was in Iceland in the, when was it, early mid-70s, I guess, late 70s or something. But I was there in the winter. So the flora was very minimal. Every time. And what struck me was that, like, I was in Reykjavik primarily. It was primarily like the climate in Reykjavik wasn't that different than Toronto, where I'd left to go there. And other than the fact that sunrise was 11 a.m. and sunset was 2 p.m. And I was, at the time I was doing some writing and stuff, and I just was really focused on it, and I would work. And I remember, and I just sort of wake up and go to sleep whenever, and I'd keep working. And I remember one time I woke up and the clock said 9 o'clock. It was pitch dark. And I had no idea whether I had just slept a little while or whether I'd slept a long time. And it was 9 in the morning or 9 at night. And I turn on the radio and it's all Icelandic. I can't understand. what it is. So, and the landlady I was staying with, she was out. So I had to get dressed and go. It wasn't until I got to the corner store and realized that because it was open, it was 9 a.m. and not closed at night. That's the only way I could tell what time of day it was.
I think it is farther north than I remembered, but it's certainly still not 24 hours.
No, I think, yeah, the Arctic Circle just touches the very uppermost tip of Iceland, I think. Yeah. That makes sense. I would love to go there and see it with life.
I think increasingly there's more and more trails in the pricing.
I mean, the other thing I found is I did try to drive into the rest of Iceland to see more, and every time I would hit a blizzard and get turned back. I mean, it was by the coast, it was not that bad climate wise because of the Gulf Stream, but you go a quarter mile inland or more, you're in the Arctic for sure. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we can wrap this up then. Thank you, people, for coming out, and I think this worked all right. Okay, so good night, y'all.
Good night.
See you in a month. So as I said, next month's meeting will be exclusively by Zoom.